Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Penguins walk so funny. I've always wanted to figure out why they walk so funny. Very excited to talk to our guest today. Before I introduce our guest, I want you all to know that I am Richard Littauer. Hello. That may be a surprise to some of you, but it's still me. It's 2025. This is the first podcast we're recording in the new year, which is really exciting. And I have a guest on the podcast today, which is really excellent because otherwise it'd just be me talking to the wall. Alison Hill is joining us. Alison is a VP of product at Anaconda, where she leads development of the core distribution enterprise and open source products. But besides that, she's also a cognitive scientist with a PhD in psychology. She's 1/3 of the Palmer Penguins team, which I'm going to have to get into and understand what penguins are and why they're palming, and a data scientist and just a long time engineer, cognitive side, computer science-y type person. That was very official sounding. Alison, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the wonderful, very official intro. Pretty spot on.
So it sounds like you started as a cognitive scientist and then went into engineering. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely an interesting path from doing cognitive science research into data science. But for me, it made total sense. I was really into statistics and I really loved that part of doing academic research. And I assume with your background too, that you might have some of that love as well. Being able to look at data that you've collected, being able to test hypotheses that you have, and really being able to own like the whole life cycle from like data collection to publication. So as a psychologist, that was part of why I loved statistics, was because it helped me to be able to do better research, own my own science, and really kind of direct my own area of study. So I got really into statistics and data science. And then from there, it was kind of a slippery slope. And I ended up leaving academia and going into industry. And then working on the data science side, I started getting really passionate about data science education. So I really embraced being able to teach other people how to use programming to be able to do better data science in academic research settings. And then I just kind of kept wanting to go from there. I kept wanting to scale up. And I found that the best way to scale up education was really to actually impact the tools themselves. So I moved into the product area.
That's really exciting. And it makes a lot of sense. At Anaconda, obviously, you're working on tools that basically help people do their science better. I feel like it's mostly a science outfit, right? We've had a few people from Anaconda on before. We've had Travis Oliphant on. Can you tell me what you do there? And are you working mainly on like R and Python? Are there particular stacks that you work on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the area of product that I focus on is called the Anaconda distribution. And so that's our distribution of Python packages or R packages as well in there. But mainly people are familiar with it from the Python ecosystem. And really what we do is we provide a secure and compatible kind of cohesive collection of packages that people can reliably use. They work together. They're all made with kind of the same system dependencies as the same backbone. And so being from the R world, I didn't totally experience these kinds of low-level system incompatibilities that the Python people apparently have been plagued with. So that's what the Anaconda distribution attempts to solve that problem. So making it so that people can focus more on, like you said, like being able to do their academic research or being able to work as a team in an enterprise setting and not having to fiddle around with understanding all the system dependencies or having to go into some low-level library and make sure that these versions are compatible with each other. The other areas of product that I oversee are anaconda.org, which is what we call our community repo. So that's a place where, a number of different industries and open source projects also host their own versions of their Python packages and keep them up to date. So NVIDIA, for example, has a community repo there. And there's a few other companies that do this as a way of being able to keep their open source binaries in a way that people can easily install and access. And then also it includes a large open source ecosystem around the Conda ecosystem. And so that was one of the biggest draws probably for me to join Anaconda, was because it's rare to find an open source project like Conda that's been around for so long and has been sustained for so long. It's definitely been kind of like one of the OG bigger open source projects. There's a whole ecosystem around there. There's also like a Conda Forge ecosystem, which is separate from Anaconda, but that's the place where community developers develop their own Conda packages. And then we provide additional support around the Conda command line experience, the CLI.
Got it. So just for reference, Anaconda isn't necessarily like, it's not a small shop of open source people. It's a well-resourced business that has a well-resourced ecosystem around it. Where does Anaconda get most of its funds from? How does it keep itself sustainable?
Oh, that's a really great question. So Anaconda has a number of customers. So we actually have more of an enterprise offering that allows people to be able to use the Anaconda packages and be able to scale those up in an enterprise setting. So being able to get all the things that you would expect for an organization that they would need to be able to access packages safely, be able to filter basically what packages their employees are allowed to use, which ones that they want to be able to distribute internally, which ones they want to host themselves. So we have a number of different products that basically support open source usage and being able to do it in a secure and kind of controllable way at the like IT level. So all of those basic like enterprise controls that you would expect. But that's how Anaconda sustains itself. And then we are continuing to kind of try to do that open source virtuous cycle of development. So being able to reinvest then back into open source communities and the tooling that we provide that is available to anyone that doesn't have to be using Anaconda for commercial purposes.
And I assume that's because the open source ecosystem allows you to have more skill, allows you to have a larger labor pool, allows you to tap into larger markets. And so it's not necessarily a loss leader so much as an offering that opens up an ability for more enterprise clients to say, like, this is actually useful to us.
Yes, exactly. You got it.
That all makes a lot of sense to me from like a corporate perspective, right? This is very clear corporate science, open source, where the science is also going into industry because people need to crunch data there too. Right. They need to figure these things out. And oftentimes they will be using people like you who had a real passion for academia in some way and then realize, well, academia is kind of horrible. Let's leave it behind and maybe make some money and do some good work at the same time. And so now you're sort of in that sweet spot where the skills that you learned are also really useful. In your case, you have a really interesting career because you also were the first PM of data science communication at Posit, which I guess used to be RStudio and is no longer RStudio. Tell me a bit about how that role worked and how it segued into what you currently do.
That was a really fun role as my first product role. So when I first joined RStudio, I was a member of the brand new data science education team. And it was a really cool team because it was a small team. I think it was like 4 people at the time. So Greg Wilson was another member of the team, Minay Chetankaya Randell, Garrett Groleman. And we were all kind of in this pod together trying to scale up data science education. And it was a really exciting challenge for me because I'd been doing data science education in the classroom, doing workshops, teaching remotely for several years. And I'd gotten to the point in academia where I was like, I just really want to be able to impact more people and be able to kind of break out of this like workshop / 3-month course box that I was in. And I thought it was a really interesting challenge, especially to try to teach to enterprise customers because they're coming in and you might be familiar, if anyone's familiar with Posit who's listening, they have a large annual conference where really the workshops ahead of the conference are a huge deal. And they usually are taught by like the best in the industry people, but you've got like 2 days to be able to make a really big difference in the way that people work. So people who sign up for those workshops need to be able to come back to work and be able to use the things that you taught them right away. And I thought that was a really fascinating challenge to really get better at because I'd been used to teaching in these kind of like longer term, longer scope circumstances. And then I'd been doing some more workshops, but I thought this was really interesting to be able to talk to people who need to do this for their jobs. They need to train up their own teams when they get back. They really need to be able to scale it out. So you can kind of think of each person in a workshop as like one member of a pod that then it needs to scale out to probably like 30 in their company because they're paying a lot of money for these workshops and they need to be able to come back to their companies and be like, here's what I learned. Here's what we can do differently now. So we were working on tackling those kinds of challenges. And then I got to the point where I told one of my bosses that I felt like I was doing postmortem education. So I was teaching things, but I wasn't able to actually make the tools better. So I was in this place where I was constantly in contact with users. I was hearing what they were asking for. I was kind of front row seat for their pain at using things and seeing people trying to use things in that short of a time and being able to teach it too. It's a real challenge and it really surfaces the usability problems and the features that are lacking for people who are kind of on the like cutting edge of trying to use the products. And so for me, I really wanted to actually be able to go back to the developers and have some kind of loop where I could be like, okay, I don't want to just teach it at the end of your entire development cycle. I want to be able to use what I know about how people think and how people approach learning and about the context within which they're working. Because I know a lot about how data scientists actually want to work and the kinds of things that they're trying to do. And so bringing that context in and having that focus on usability early on, in my experience, has actually made a huge difference in the way that the products that I work on are developed. And so that was my first pitch to RStudio when I was there. I was like, I really want to do this over here. And nobody's doing this right here, right now. We had a bunch of different development teams that were working all in what was called the R Markdown ecosystem. And this was sort of like an ecosystem that had been around for a while. We had a number of sort of like, it was like a constellations, but nobody was at the center of it. And I kept trying to ask people when I was teaching, what's the next thing that's on the roadmap? What are we doing? What are we doing about this? Or there's this change over here in the market. Are we doing something that would meet that? How are we going to be able to provide tools that help our users be able to do this new thing that they want to be able to do? And so that's where the person that I was reporting to at the time was like, hey, that's what a product person does. And I was like, okay, teach me product because that's what I want to do. And for RStudio, I think it was a really fascinating journey for me and for them because they'd never had an open source product manager. But I was able to do like a 6-month trial, I believe. So it was getting the developers kind of used to that and having them get used to having a person that was coordinating amongst the developer teams, but then also being the person that was like the glue between the enterprise users and themselves. Because at RStudio, like many companies that I've been at since, a lot of times the open source developers are kind of doing product at the same time as they're developing. And a lot of times they're kind of the front lines for customers, or they're hearing feedback from users all the time. They're seeing GitHub issues constantly, right? They're sometimes feeling like they're just drowning in feedback. And yet at the same time, there's not anyone helping them to be able to say like, hey, here's the overarching strategy. Here's the pillars of the business that we need to be making improvements on and building towards. And then here's how your product fits into that bigger fabric. And so that's, I felt like what my role at RStudio ended up being. And it was really a fun challenge. And when I left, I definitely heard from the developers that I worked with that they all felt like their impact was that much greater because they actually had more context. They knew more about how people were using their tools. And they also knew more and could kind of speak more to how what they were doing on a daily basis was actually impacting the business itself, which I think is another kind of thing that happens in open source teams and industry a lot, is that sometimes they can feel really separate from the actual way that the company is making money.
I had a guest on this show once, Tracy Hines. I've actually had her on a few times now, and we had a really interesting conversation about product managers in open source, where it's a necessary part of open source projects that gets totally left by the wayside, and there hasn't been a really clear way of talking about how important it is in a successful open source project to have a product manager sort of liaise between people and do more than a PM or a community manager.
Yes.
What strikes me as I'm listening to you is that RStudio and Anaconda are two already very successful projects. And so they had to have gotten to a certain place where they could even afford to think about having a product manager. And I don't want to use the term PM because it gets very confusing with project manager. But where do you think that sweet spot is where product starts to make sense as more than just a hat, but as an official role for someone? Do you think it's necessary for any open source project to have a product manager? Or is there, you have to be this high to ride the ride? Is there like a cutoff at which it's like, oh yeah, this is good?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It's something I've definitely spent a lot of time thinking about. So I think that, there's a really great article from Intercom, which is kind of like an RIP publication by Stripe. And in it, this author said that basically everything is a product because if it has users, it's a product. And so if you're developing open source software and you have users in mind, it's already a product. And so it exists. And the real question is whether you want it to be a successful product that has user adoption, that has user love, that helps it to kind of gain an audience so that it can actually start to innovate, so that you can get innovative features and be able to really meet the needs of like the most advanced users, which are usually what open source users are bringing to the table, is that there are people who are sampling a lot of tools. They've stumbled upon your tool in particular because it solves a problem that they have. And so they're a very discerning audience usually. Early on, I think usually the people who have developed open source software are themselves kind of naturally product people. My best example of this is at RStudio. I worked with JJ Allaire very closely and Hadley Wickham. And they both were actually kind of naturally like product oriented. So they both naturally had a strategy in mind for the thing they wanted to build, the types of users that they were focusing on, and the specific needs that those people would have, and being able to kind of think ahead too, like kind of being able to say that these are the needs that they're going to have, not just wait until they stumble on it and then develop around it. And so they were able to get some early traction with their tools without having any product people. So I don't think a product person is critical, especially for early open source projects. But I do have an opinion that any company that's trying to support an open source project should have a product person. I have a really high bar and expectation for open source projects that have a company or corporate support behind them. I think that it's their duty to have someone who's helping the developers to be able to make sure that they're building valuable features, and also someone who's a point person for delivering actual value to the real users. So I think that there's a lot of projects that I've seen that have corporate backing, but may not have put the investment into having a product person, or they've gotten confused and they may invest in a person, but they're really doing more project management. So as you said, you didn't want to use the PM label, because I think sometimes people think that's like a project manager. I've seen companies make this mistake, and I think that it's really doing a disservice for users. And it usually ends up being something that you can predict sometimes years in advance and be able to say like, oof, that's not going to go well if you're treating this like a project and if you're not treating it like a product. So for me, I have a much higher bar for anything that's an open source project that has a corporate backing. And I really think that it's part of the responsibility of the company to make sure that they actually support that development team and not put product responsibilities on those developers. I think a product person can really increase the impact of a developer team way more than hiring one more developer and increasing the efficiency of them or increasing their productivity. I think the product person can really leverage the impact a lot greater.
I want to push back on the idea that there are people who are naturally product managers, because naturally what I want to do is eat Nutella and sit on the beach. That's like what my body wants to do, like, and so can you tell me a bit more about what sort of skills I need to have as a developer, as an open source person, in order to think more product oriented, as opposed to program or project oriented as well?
Yes, that's a really good question. And same. I think naturally I would love to be drinking like a virgin pina colada out on the beach right now. Yeah. So I think it's more about the people that I've seen who have been able to kind of skirt having a product manager in open source tend to be high empathy for end users. So they usually have worked in a enterprise setting or a corporate setting, some kind of like organizational setting or academic setting where they've seen kind of the pain at scale. They haven't just had like firsthand experience. They've tried to help other people, and they've tried to already create like a system or some kind of way of working around tools that helps people to be able to be more productive and do their jobs better. And so for that reason, they have like a vision and a hypothesis around like, this is why this is hard. And here's how it could be better in a systematic way, not just in like a, we support you kind of way, but in like a, hey, the reason why people want to be able to do this thing is because they don't actually have tools that help them do XYZ before that. And so we need to be able to build a readable API, for example, that allows people to be able to chain commands and be able to go from processing data to being able to plot data and be able to read their code when they come back to it 3 months later. I don't want to put words in Hadley Wickham's mouth, for example, but he definitely developed some of the most user-friendly libraries in R that I first experienced when I was learning. And for me, it felt like I was literally using tools that were made and kind of, in one of my user interviews, somebody said crafted with love. And I feel like that's like where you can get that feeling when you're a developer user, when you're using a tool that was made by somebody who's literally trying to solve the problem that they really understand, and they're trying to solve it for more than just themselves. So I think that that's kind of where you can get away with not having a product person. But I also think it's a huge load to carry. And a lot of times this means that at companies, if you rely on those kinds of people for very long, you end up with a situation where you're very highly dependent on this one person. Whereas if you were able to get somebody into a role that's more of a product oriented role, you can kind of start building up some systems and some intuition on the teams so that you don't have to have a single person that's the touch point or like the Rosetta Stone for the product. And you can start building in some resilience to the developer team so that they can all start to kind of be doing the work alongside the product person. And that's really what I saw when I was at RStudio was without having a product person there, the developers were taking this on. And a lot of times it was kind of through a combination of luck and hiring amazing people that got you around not having a product person. And yet still there's an interesting area of expertise that can evolve when you have a product person who is bridging that gap between the community of users that are using open source tools and the people who are using your tools as a company. My experience was that that's a pretty big gap always in every situation.
And so I want to drill down into every situation because you're talking about hiring on a new developer, or hiring a product manager, or helping deal with enterprise clients. And this is all very corporate speak.
Yes,
what I'm wondering is like, what happens to the other 10 million projects in the world that don't have institutional backing yet, that don't have a large collective funding mechanism or a bank account, that are just sort of bootstrapped on open source collective or something like that? What would you suggest for open source projects, which often end up in these ecosystems, right? They end up getting, well, I joined the Linux Foundation and now I'm going to be amazing. And it's like, well, here's 5% of a product manager. And then that's all you get. What do you suggest for those projects? How can they make themselves sustainable?
Question. I don't have a great answer for how to make a project more sustainable outside of a corporate entity, because that's my experience is more around the side of seeing a lot of the pain points for trying to figure out how to make an open source project make sense in a corporate setting. While I think that those projects can seem like they have a leg up, what I've seen too is that there's a lot of challenges for kind of both sides, the enterprise and business side. And that's definitely like fair enough. That's like where my brain goes, because that's my world, is living on the product side of trying to make sure that we're building sustainable business models, but at the same time, doing that in a way that really supports the long game of an open source software ecosystem, one that might not be, directly tied to revenue, or one that might not be directly tied to a top of funnel, like, classic like marketing speak. But for community projects, I think it's really an interesting challenge to think about what's the like minimum level of support that you need to not feel like you're drowning, and to be able to feel like you're providing value to the users without starting to get into that GitHub issue whack-a-mole. I'll volunteer myself as a person who has several open source projects that I have not been able to keep up with the issues. And it's really a challenge. And that's coming from somebody who wanted to be able to make something that scaled and provided value to more than one person. But being able to have anyone who's a level of support, I think helps. But I think a 5% product manager, I'm not sure how much value I would even get out of such a person. But I do think that there's systems that you can put into place for yourself as a community maintainer that can help you to be able to better engage with community members and feel like you're able to provide air cover, I guess, a little bit for being able to respond to issues when you're not able to actually meet the person's request. Because I think for me, the thing that killed me was a lot of feature requests that I wanted to develop. I desperately did, but I just didn't have the time or the bandwidth. And I see this happening a lot when you hop into somebody's GitHub issues. Is like, somebody will ask for a feature and the maintainer will either say very strongly with a good intent that like, this is just out of scope, I'm not able to develop this, or I simply don't have the bandwidth, but PR is welcome essentially. And then there's also some that I feel like, get kind of trapped. And this was probably more the category that I fell into of like, just maybe not responding or feeling like you're drowning in these issues. So I think that for community maintainers, I think some of the best advice that I've given friends who are community maintainers and that I've tried to take on myself is, if you really want it to be a project that continues to go on, try to figure out a system that works for you to come into it and leave it. And I think that's probably like the healthiest thing, is not always be an always on developer. But if you start getting into this mode, one of the things that we did at RStudio was that even those projects, there was a number of different open source projects that we supported. And there would be times where we would say like, okay, we're over here on this other project for now. So if you file as a GitHub issue, we may not respond to you within, 2 or 3 months. We're going to be coming back to this. And we kind of would go on cycles amongst the different projects. So we weren't always on every single, doing active development on every single one of the repositories on GitHub. And so I think sometimes that can be healthy too, is to kind of like lay out what are the expectations for your responsivity and what you're willing to develop, or what you really could use assistance on, what you could really use help on. And then saying, what are some things that maybe for you are out of scope for your project, because presuming that you have the project and you want it to keep going, there's probably some things that you could write out that are like more contributing guidelines that could help people to be able to understand why you think it's out of scope, or how you could develop a system that might make it easier for people to contribute in a way that you actually feel like you can support too. Because that was another challenge that I've often felt the kind of tension of, is people offering me PRs, but they were things that I didn't even have time to review and I didn't have the skill set to review. And those are the things that also start affecting your contributions and people's goodwill towards you. And I think those are the things that, at least for me and the people that I know that are open source contributors, get challenged by. And I think as long as you can kind of develop transparent systems of communication with you and your users, that's probably the minimum viable product that you can do if you don't have a corporate strategy or someone who's coming in to help you to be able to scale some kind of business and tie it to revenue and be able to do all the stuff that sort of makes me cringe now when I think about like how it sounds to me 5 years ago, but are things that are part of like everyday conversations when you're at a company that bridges these two worlds, basically the open source and the enterprise ecosystems.
As someone who's been in open source ecosystems as well as academia, as well as corporate ecosystems, it seems that you might have some insights on whether diving into a large hosted ecosystem is the best way to make your project sustainable. I can go out right now and I can say, I want to build a house on 7 continents. Okay, so immediately I have way too much on my plate. Just planning that is going to take all of my time. But that's not really what I want to do as Richard. That's kind of what open source is like. You start a project and you realize, oh, I could do this, 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 and this. And then all of a sudden you have 1,000 issues. And then once you make something, people come to you with their ideas. And so it's always a question of limiting your bandwidth and limiting your time. And so when we talk about sustainability here, we're not just talking about how do you, set boundaries around issues? How do you do this? But how do you make the core thing that you want to do as a person economically viable so that you can then continue to do it in a way that's healthy for you and healthy for the community and for the project? And it seems to me, Alison, that what you've sort of figured out is that the best way to do it is to go all in on some sort of enterprise system that's tangential, at least not orthogonal to open source ecosystems, in the sense that, hey, you can still help people do science, you can still help people be awesome, and you can still learn stuff about product management and up your skills by being part of a larger ecosystem that also allows enterprise clients, which gives you funds to be able to support yourself. Do you feel like for people in the open science movement or people in the open source movement, which is slightly different but still relevant, the best thing for them to do is actually get involved in a large ecosystem that then would allow them to have the feedback and tools and manpower from other people who are interested in having their project be successful as well? Or is there a future for independent people doing this sort of work who just want to have their project work on its own?
As you were speaking, I was just thinking, the examples that I've seen that are successful versus the examples that I've seen that are not successful. I think the ones that are successful are ones where you enter into it like eyes wide open and you know exactly what you're trying to achieve by entering into some like larger ecosystem. And really the biggest thing is, like, as you said, I assume then that you want more users. If you do not want more users, do not get more eyeballs. Like if you're joining kind of a larger ecosystem and you're trying to get more traction, then, really the question for a maintainer or developer is why? What are you trying to achieve through that? I mean, I think there's some larger projects that I've been sort of adjacent to that have been really successful in this, but I think it's a really hard road to hoe. So I'm thinking of like Wes McKinney with the Apache Arrow project, for example, and how he got that going. I think that was a real challenging on-ramp for Apache Arrow, but it was the best way forward for Wes to have the impact that he wanted to. So I think you have to be really clear-eyed about that impact and where you see the project going and figuring out for yourself whether you want to be the point person or whether there's an army there that you can gather of people who are facing similar problems and would come to the same solution, and you can kind of scale yourself that way versus being like the sole person who's like the benevolent dictator for life. Yeah. So when I usually see like a BDFL type person, I would say like, do what makes you happy and do the thing that gives you the impact that you want to see. But I think my specific experience has been more on the side of seeing projects that have corporate support and thinking from that side of things where things can go wrong. So I think there's a lot of open source projects that don't have corporate support that have been very successful and that have all kind of, different methods of sustaining themselves. And I think that there's some really interesting business models that are coming out from that for individual contributors. So for example, I know that there's some Hugo themes, for example, that I was trying to use when I was teaching. Yep. And I wasn't able to keep using one of them because the main developer had created more of like a subscription-based plan. And I was like, well, I can't really teach that for a workshop anymore, because one of my kind of ethos of teaching an open source workshop was I didn't want anyone to kind of feel like they were going to be on the hook for paying for anything on a monthly basis after they were done working with me. But I totally respected the fact that the developer went in that direction because he was providing a lot of support. He had to do that to make himself happy. And you kind of have to be able to say like, okay, so maybe my project won't be used by educators who are teaching a 2-day workshop like I was. Maybe they're not going to support me for that. But there's a number of people who would actually pay for that and would see real value in it. And frankly, if I had just been a sole person who was just kind of picking a stack and going with it for ease of use for myself, I would have probably used his tool and paid for it. So I think that there's a number of different interesting like business models that people can come to for being able to try to sustain their efforts. And I really applaud those kinds of efforts. Like I think Make Docs, for example, might be one of them, like Sphinx for Make Docs, that one. I have not used that one, but I know a number of people who pay for that support that the maintainer offers. And so I think there's a number of like really interesting programs that people are doing around those. And I think that that's probably the way that you can try to provide the baseline value that you want to with the open source ecosystem, but then still be able to create something sustainable for yourself that meets your same goals. But you also have to be prepared for, the people who will criticize for anything. There's always people who will criticize for charging for anything open source. And I've definitely seen in GitHub issues, for example, on some of those projects that I was referencing, where people have pushed back on it when the change initially started being like more publicized and communicated. But I think that there's a kind of growing recognition, I hope, from users that I want the people that make software that I use and rely on to be happy and supported. And I want them to feel like they can make a living off their thing. I don't want anyone to be making software that I'm using for free and have them be feeling like they can't support themselves, their families, or their lifestyles. But I think for that reason too, I think from where I sit, I see a number of projects that are getting more corporate sponsorship being more successful. And that's kind of a challenge. I don't want it to be the case where you have to have a corporate sponsor to be able to succeed in open source. To me, that would be a sad state of affairs if we got to like 2030 and every single open source project had to have a corporate backer. And I think we've seen some examples of where that has gone kind of awry, where a company has been the primary supporter and then the tool and the tool chain is out there and unsupported. So for example, my previous employer, Voltron Data, recently had a large kind of reduction in force, I guess, on the engineering side. And so the Apache Arrow ecosystem, the main contributors to the Apache Arrow ecosystem that were employed by Voltron Data ended up looking for kind of a new corporate sponsorship. And I believe they found it in a company called QuantStack. And so that's a really good example of that's a really huge ecosystem that struggled to, continue to get the corporate sponsorship that they needed for the core maintainers. And so I see my experience is really more in terms of thinking about those kinds of maintainers and seeing those people employed in industry and kind of being a little bit maybe misunderstood or having this like mismatch between the corporate interests and the open source ecosystems that they support. And sort of this like two worlds thing means that there's a lot of like weird conversations that can happen and a lot of weird incentive structures that make it very challenging. And I think that that's kind of where an open source product person who knows about open source ecosystems and has that experience can actually help and be a useful resource for both the development teams, but also for the business to better understand the value that they're sitting on. Because I've definitely seen a number of instances where people have different perceptions. And if you don't know open source, one thing that's I've found as a challenge is it's really hard to explain it to people who haven't used it or developed with it before.
Yeah. No, that all makes sense to me. And one thing that I want to add as an addendum maybe is that not every open source project needs to be funded in itself. Sometimes it's useful for other reasons. It's useful for maybe a CV or portfolio. For example, I don't think Palmer Penguins, which sounds like is a data set for data exploration, which has penguins that are really cute. I love the visualizations. This is really great. You co-wrote it, so you know all about it. But listeners should go check this thing out. Palmer Penguins probably doesn't need to be funded. Right. It was a cool project that showed how to use R better. And it's pretty much done as far as I can see. It looks like it's finished. And maybe I'm missing something here, but like that was really useful for you for talking about data. And that's it. That's the whole point. Am I wrong?
No, exactly. Yeah. So Palmer Penguins was like a hobby project that myself, Alison Horst, and Kristen Gorman did kind of back at the beginning of COVID. And we were really challenging ourselves to find better data sets for visualization. So ones that didn't involve iris and measurements around those flowers, because we were all kind of sick of them. And at the time too, there was also some more like historical context that we felt like was kind of making it more of a challenge to talk about irises without bringing in a lot of context that you didn't really need to in order to teach data visualization well. So we created Palmer Penguins, and yeah, it was a bit of a development project during COVID, but when it was done and it's there.
Yeah, cool.
But I also can't say that there's anything innovative going to be happening in Palmer Penguins. And that's why I don't know what you could do with the data set, but nothing will be, because we are all gainfully employed in other areas. But it was a great project. So yeah, there's definitely some really great examples of open source projects that don't require any kind of backing or ongoing support or maintenance. But I think that's also one of the challenges too for users, is that a lot of times people are coming into these ecosystems and they don't totally understand open source. Yeah. And so they see something like Palmer Penguins that hasn't been updated in 3 years, and they might think, oh, like it's a project that I can't use, or I don't understand why I would use this over this other thing, right? And so being able to have those kinds of conversations inside an organization and inside open source groups, I think is really helpful to be able to set expectations, level set expectations. Like maybe in the README for Palmer Penguins, we should note that there's no active development going on the Palmer Penguins too. It's done.
Love that project, by the way. Go check it out if you're ever using R and you just get sick of looking at flowers. If you're done with botany and want to run the birds, that's cool. Alison, this is great. There's so much more I want to talk to you about, but unfortunately, I live in a world in which time proceeds at 1 second per second, and I need to just bow to that, the whims of the time gods. So where can people learn more about you on the web?
So I have a less often updated website at apreshill.com. So it's APRESHILL.com. So that's my personal website. You'll see more outdated blog posts from when I was a product manager at RStudio and thinking more about the R Markdown ecosystem. I have been less sporadically updating my website as I've got a young child and increasing responsibilities at work. Yeah. Open source projects. It is. PR's welcome.
Yeah. Are we graying out as a field, or are we just all having kids? I don't know. One of the two. Thank you so much.
It's a good question.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really great. Do check it out. You can find her links to her socials there. You can also find all the links that we've sort of mentioned, and I put some of them in the show notes. So you can go to podcast@sustainoss.org to see those links. Don't leave yet. At the end of every show, we have Spotlight. It's part of the show where we highlight people, places, things, objects, nouns that we think just need a bit more light shed on them. So traditionally, the host goes first. My spotlight today is going to be Bernard Cornwell. I just really, really love historical fiction set in the Middle Ages and also set in the Napoleonic era. If you haven't had the chance to read any of Sharp with an E, it's incredibly bad historical novels, which work really well when you're on a plane and you have nothing to do for 14 hours. So just thank you, Bernard Cornwell, for keeping me sane when solitaire just didn't cut it. Really excellent, fun reads. Highly suggest. Alison, what is your spotlight today?
Well, as you were talking, I realized that I'm really enjoying a book that my daughter and I are reading right now. So she's 7 and it's called Impossible Creatures. It's really, really fun. It's a great book. So I highly recommend it if you have young children.
Impossible Creatures. Excellent. Thank you so much. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have spotlights you want to suggest, you can send them to us at podcast@sustainoss.org. You can also go to podcast.sustainoss.org to see the show notes and other guests that we've had on this podcast. You can go to opencollective.com/sustainoss to donate to this podcast so we can continue it going, which is something we need direly right now. That would be really, really great. Besides that, share it on social media. Tell your friends, hey, you got to listen to this podcast. It's the best one in the world. I don't know any podcast that is as relevant to my life as this one. Truly, it is amazing and inimitable and inevitable and inexorable that you're all going to listen to it, friends. So really, just say that. Just quote to your friends. That'd be great. Besides that, hit us up on social media. We're on Blue Sky. We're on Mastodon. I think somehow we're on GitHub if you want to open an issue. That'd be really, really cool. One person did write me recently. Thank you so much, Huey Lee, for pointing out that Stephen Colbert doesn't care about the Puteke Teke. That was actually John Oliver. John Oliver cares. So in episode whatever, where I mentioned the Poteke Peke and Stephen Colbert, I was just confusing my love of Stephen Colbert for John Oliver. Both of them love New Zealand, but that was a mess up. Thank you. This has been the errata part of the podcast. With that having been said, thank you all so much. Thank you, Alison, for coming on. Best of luck. It sounds like
thank you.
You know exactly what you're doing and everything is really, really clear for you, which isn't always the case. So keep it up. And thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you.